In this session, we will be given the tools to lead children into a place of healing and hope. And we certainly have the right individuals to teach us those tools. This really is an impressive panel. Not that the rest of you weren't, but this is a really impressive panel. Our moderator for this session has a very impressive and long background in this particular area. Steve Woods is a child development specialist who has spent the past 50 years working with children and their families in various settings, such as the public education, religion, community mental health, child daycare centers, family literacy, and grief support groups. His lifelong career interest and graduate thesis work have been helping children cope with death and grief. Before his retirement, he was the Family Services Coordinator for Highmark Caring Place, a center for grieving children and their families. Steve currently volunteers at Children's Hospital at Pittsburgh of UPMC in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. I have to tell you two things. First of all, I don't believe that he's been doing this for 50 years because he looks way too young for that. I guess working with children keeps you young. Yes, there you go. Oh, did he make that up? And secondly, the rumor is, and I think it's true, is that retirement really is a big joke because he's busier now than he was before. So I give you Steve Woods.
I guess I'm older than I look. I have 12 grandchildren, just to put an addendum to that. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about responding to children's needs. I want to thank all the presenters this morning for just a tremendous, tremendous job. And, you know, all of you, I'm sure, in addition to being hungry at lunchtime, had just an emotional response to the presentations this morning and hearing all the stories, and especially the stories from Adam and from the teacher from the school. And it always just struck me that that plane went down, you know, just within, I guess, a mile or so of that school, which had all the children in the county in that area, in that one school building, and what a tragedy that would have been and how close that was. And if you ever go to Shanksville and go into the town and you see that location, you'll be struck even more, I think, by the drama and by the potential greater tragedy that could have happened at this site that didn't happen because of the tremendous heroes and the heroic efforts of the passengers on Flight 93. One of the things that, under Hedda's leadership, several of us are working on developing a new little pamphlet for children. And it tells the story at a child's level. And we've been wrestling with that for a number of months now. And one day this summer, we met at Hedda's office and had gone over the story, and we read the story in a child's version again and again and again, and re-edited it and changed this word and changed that word, and got feedback from other people and other people's notes and changed another word, and just an editing process to try to get this story right for the children. And you think of what the story is of these people on this plane that has been hijacked, and they decide to take it back and to do what they can do to keep it from crashing into Washington. And they knew that they weren't sure what could happen, but you know, they were going to do this. They were going to do this heroic act and put their lives at even greater risk, but all in the hope that somehow they could put an end to this horror that they knew had already happened in New York City and in Washington. And I was struck by the heroic horror of this story. And that horror is what strikes us as adults, and what somehow also the children pick up on when they hear the story. Oh, this must be just horrible. What a horrible position to be in. As we went over the story again and again and again, I found myself on that plane with these passengers. And I found myself asking myself the question over and over and over again all afternoon, could I have done this? Could I have done what they did? And so our meeting was over, and I went home, and my wife is still working, and so I got dinner ready, which I do every night. I'm a good retired husband. And it was a warm summer day. I went and sat on the porch to await her arrival. And 45 minutes later, I woke up. And I said to myself, oh my gosh, what happened? And, you know, I'm an old man. I know what an old man's nap feels like. This was not an old man's nap. And what I realized was that my entire emotional internal computer just shut down like that from having confronted this story again and again and again all afternoon. One of the things that I think we as workers with children really need to be aware of when we confront these kind of very, very emotionally charged issues is, what's our response? What is our response to this story? Because if we don't get in touch with our own response to this story and what it triggers in us, we wind up tripping over it when we try to deal with the children. So it's very, very important to ask yourself, how does this story impact me and my life? And then we can talk about responding to the children. And I just want to share two more stories with you, just very briefly. Year's 1972, and I was working in a daycare program in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. And McKeesport was a thriving mill town at that point in history. The mill has long since gone, but it was very, very thriving, and there were 10,000 children in the school district. Now I think there are 2. And we had a child daycare program that had 300 children in it. And in one of the school buildings, we had this entire little school building in a neighborhood. It was devoted to all the preschool classrooms for this daycare program. So we had 5 preschool classrooms and all their staff, and I'd invited Fred Rogers out, he was a friend of mine, to see the center, because it was really unique at that time, having that many preschool classes together. And so Fred came out, and I took him out into the play yard to be with the teachers and the children, and I went back inside. It was a warm day. It was a day like today. And I went back inside to take care of some business in the office, and I came back out to find Fred on the playground, and I looked around and looked all over the place, and I didn't see him. There were kids all over the place and teachers, and all of a sudden over here in this one corner was this cluster of little children, like a football huddle, you know, and I looked over there, and there in the middle of the huddle, of course, was Fred. He wasn't standing up, he was sitting down at the children's level here on this dirty playground. It was just a city school playground. And Fred was down on the ground listening to the children, just listening. And they were just firing their questions at him and their stories at him. And Fred was the ultimate listener. I just wanted to share that story as kind of a capsule on this morning. The theme this morning is listening to children, and how we listen to children, how very important it is to be present in our listening. And then just one more story, which took place just this past summer. As part of this whole process, Head and I went out to the Flight 93 Memorial, and Jeff took us on a tour and showed us around, but the new memorial was not yet open to the public. And so I was up on the hillside just watching some of the families as they were at the old memorial site, looking over the new memorial and they were explaining to each other what had happened. And there was this father with a 9-year-old daughter, and he was explaining to her in very, very vivid details how the airplane flew over where they were standing right there and flipped over and then crashed. And because of all the fuel tanks, it burst into flames, and all the people were killed. And then he told the little girl that there were 37 passengers on the plane. And his 9-year-old daughter looked at him with a puzzled look and said, "Daddy, why were there passengers on a fuel tank plane?" And you know, the dad was so good. He listened to her. He listened to her question. In her 9-year-old mind, you know, as soon as he mentioned fuel tanks exploding, she envisioned a tanker plane, you know, not a plane filled with passengers. So he then went on to explain to her and to give her the information she needed that, in fact, every airplane is like a tanker. There's fuel in all the wings, there's fuel in the body, and fuel everywhere. And so he explained to his daughter what that meant that it was a passenger plane that exploded and not a fuel tank plane. And so I just use this dad as an example of listening and then also responding to a child's questions and to a child's needs so that they get clarification. And we heard this morning of how the older children, really often will need clarification, can use their cognitive ability to begin to understand what happened at this horrendously tragic event. What I'd like to do is we're going to reverse our order today, and Dr. Mary Margaret Kerr is going to speak first, and then Hedda will, and I'm going to introduce Hedda. I'm going to come back and introduce you, Hedda. We'll close the afternoon with you. Mary Margaret Kerr has had a phenomenal experience in her career. She's had a foot in the community mental health field and a foot in the education field. And so she brings that mental health and education balance, which is tremendous. Very often we get tremendous mental health people and tremendous education people. Mary Margaret Kerr brings both of those backgrounds to us, and we're very fortunate to have her with us today. You can read her bio in the pamphlet that you have, and she is currently the chair of Administration and Policy Studies for the School of Education. The other amazing part of her experience is she has worked very carefully with 2 other airplane crashes, and she'll tell you about those right now.
It's an honor to be in this room with these people, with the memory of Fred Rogers, with whom I indirectly worked for many years in crisis. Whenever there was a crisis that had the potential to affect children, one of my first phone calls was to Bill Eisler to say, I'm going to need some more of the orange brochures. The orange brochures were with me when I took a team into the airport after U.S. Air Flight 427 crashed and killed everyone. And at that time, in the history of aviation crashes, families did not get the kinds of services that surviving families have made it absolutely possible for families to have now. Those were very difficult times to provide any kind of mental health services or even any just babysitting or help. All that has changed, and it has changed only because of the courage of families who lost people on those flights, including families very close to here who lost young people on the Pan Am flight, which took many Seton Hill students, in case you didn't know that piece of history. And I remember just about to give up on getting into one of the U.S. Air lounges where the families were waiting and where children were bored and confused and crying. And I went to the desk of this very nervous U.S. Air customer service person who was told, just keep people out. And I said, I won't stay, but I've just brought some materials from Mr. Rogers. And he said, the Mr. Rogers? And I said, yes. Do you think it would be all right if I just put them on the tables? He said, you can stay as long as you want. I have no idea what I'm doing here. Please stay. And I always remember that story because I don't know who was reassured more by that moment. The young customer service agent trying to figure out what in the heck he was supposed to do with a sea of distraught people, or the veteran crisis responder who thought, I'm just not sure I'm going to get in this time. But I still have Fred Rogers brochures in the trunk of my car. I thought what we might do today is to unpack a little bit this construct of trauma. We hear a lot about trauma. We use it as a household word increasingly, and yet sometimes we don't exactly understand what its key essential pieces are. And I wrote this, the paper that you have as a handout on your tables. I wrote that paper in the days following September 11th because our center was receiving so many phone calls from folks saying, well, what do we tell people? How do we explain this? We're having a faculty meeting. We're trying to get this across. It's really pretty confusing. And when I looked at the materials that in those years we used, they tended to be long sets of tables, lists and lists and lists of very good information about children's reactions. But I realized one night trying to put my arms around this whole area that maybe the lists didn't make quite as much meaning for folks until you explained where the behaviors and reactions on the lists connected to this whole idea of trauma. And so I wrote this piece, and I'll share it with you today through this presentation briefly. And also I've brought that piece for you to take, and you're welcome to use it. We'll look at how these essential elements influence the reactions that children have and why certain supports are more likely to be effective with children than others. And then we'll quickly think about the time frame, how long does it take to recover from a crisis, and when to seek additional help for a child who's in your care. It's very important to understand what we mean by trauma. Trauma is a term, of course, that has arisen primarily and originally from wartime, as early as the Civil War, in fact. And there are a few key words, if you will look at this definition from the psychiatry field, that I think are important whether you care for psychiatry or not. And so let me unpack it just a little bit for you, if you will. I think the first thing to know about trauma, which we learn in this first sentence, is that you didn't have to be there. You can have experienced trauma, of course, but you could also have witnessed trauma or confronted, you could have been confronted by an event, but you could have just been a witness to it, and that witnessing could be rather indirect. That is not to say that by coming to this meeting today, we've all subjected you to trauma. It certainly was not among our Act 48 goals. But you know the feeling of being close to someone who tells and retells the story of a trauma and how that feels to you. And that is what we call in the field vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatic stress. It's important also to notice that a trauma doesn't have to mean that someone has died. Children can experience trauma just because of an injury or something that scared them very badly, that was a threat to their physical well-being but didn't really harm them. And I think that this notion of honoring those who are not directly in a situation but could also have a very strong reaction to it is very important. And finally, and these are really the key words to understanding children's reactions, at least in my experience, the person's response involves three distinct pieces: helplessness, fear, and horror. Intense fear, horror, and helplessness. And I like to add unpredictability. One of the most hopeful messages about trauma is that most of us will have it, but most of us will survive it. Most people survive post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder without having elaborate and sophisticated mental health services. I think that speaks to the community of helpers that Mr. Rogers certainly wrote and talked about. It speaks to the power of the ambassadors who sit with us, many of whom had no background in this work, I imagine, but just wanted to be helpful. And I think that you don't always realize, as someone outside of the trauma field, just how powerful you are. I once went into a site where there had been a crash, and I turned to my colleague who's very, very well trained in psychiatry, and I said, I really don't think I belong here. I mean, really, my background is in special ed. He said, if you think you're staying in the car, that's not going to happen. And I said, but I don't have anything to say to these people. I can't really help them. Everyone died. He said, you help them by being present. I said, I don't think that's going to do much for people. He said, just wait and see. And he was absolutely correct. So that sense of helplessness, which will also come to you when you try to help others through a crisis, is you're going to feel it, and it's going to give you real butterflies in your stomach and maybe a headache, and you may even shake a little bit. What you must always remember is that you can be present. I said to a group of teachers once after a trauma, because that's when we really learn what to do the next time, what was it that was helpful to you and what was it that was not helpful? And one of the teachers said, I knew when I saw your team that there would be tomorrow. I said, why? She said, because you seemed hopeful and none of us could be. So I begin this by saying that while we're going to share a number of tips and tools and activities and things that you can do, the most important gift that you bring to someone who has experienced a trauma is your presence, your simple, caring presence. And always hang on to that when the nerves come and overtake you and make you want to stay in the car. The impact of a crisis, in other words, how severely a child will experience a crisis, depends on several factors, and this is a short list of them. How physically close was the child to the event or the perpetrator or the classroom where a shooting took place, for example, or a fire? What was the child's perception of their own safety and security? And our colleagues this morning certainly spoke about the developmental meanings that children make of events. So it's not always the facts. Well, you weren't really even there, so how could you be so upset? It really is, what did that child perceive? Something we really usually don't know unless they can talk about it or tell us somehow. The impact of a crisis has a great deal to do with the supportive relationships that adults and others provide, and you are a part of that group of adults. It has a lot to do with how disrupted the system is. When children lose their school building, when they lose their homes, when they experience tremendous disruption, such as we saw after Hurricane Katrina, then the impact of a crisis is clearly much greater for them. It's one of the reasons that you will hear folks in this work, including our distinguished colleague Marlene Wong, who said last week to a group, the goal is to return children to calm routines. And Marlene can say that in such a way that you just feel better. She's done trauma work around the world, and she just says calm routines. I find myself waking up now, I'm just going, calm. It's become a mantra for me. And of course, the other impact factor is how much time has passed since the incident. Those who experience trauma, of course, often have one or more emotional, that's feelings, behavioral, that's something you can see, or cognitive, those are thinking kinds of reactions. And the key piece, I think, to grasp is that those reactions aren't random. I think for many of us, for many years, they just seemed kind of random, and you just looked at the tables and went down the list of reactions and figured, oh, they're having this one or this one or this one, and that's kind of how those tables were written. In fact, they're very predictable in a certain special kind of way, and understanding what you may face really helps you to calm down and be helpful after a trauma. So let's look at this echoing here a little bit. If you look at the first key piece of trauma, which is shock and surprise, the person had no idea this was going to happen, then these kinds of reactions make a bit more sense to you. Look at them if you will. So when somebody has had a terrible shock, then they are upset when you change the routine. They don't want surprises anymore. They want control and predictability and order. That's what they're looking for. They want to control what happens. Trauma survivors are often very bossy people. I remember talking to a young psychiatrist after 427, and she said, I think it's amazing that every survivor's family has a family member with a personality disorder, which is a clinical term. And I said, no, they don't. She said, no, they do. These people are calling me up at all hours. They want me to be here. They're telling me what to do and where they're going. I said, no. They're just trauma survivors. They just need to control something, so they will. You see this across the lifespan. My grandmother used to insist that I come over and spend a day with her in her nursing home when she was 104, housekeeping. We need to get this under control. This is really out of order. And I remember thinking once, this is really weird. She just has one room and one dresser drawer, one bureau. What's to organize? And then I realized it was her way of organizing a world that had completely fallen apart for her. She had buried every member of her family except me. And that's what if she wanted to organize her hosiery drawer, that's what we were going to do. Children will become very controlling and very bossy. In one example of this, I was at the home of a child whose father died on 427, and the family was upset, and he was acting out. He was 5. And I said, let me take him for a minute. And I sat with him and I said, what's the matter, honey? He says, I don't like any of this food. I don't eat mixed food. They keep bringing mixed food. I don't eat mixed food, and I'm not going to ever eat mixed food. I said, wow, you really don't like mixed food. He said, no, I do not. And who's in charge around here anyway? Are you in charge? I said, right now I am in charge. And I'm going to handle this problem about the mixed food. He said, good. I said, I need a little more information. What does the mixed food look like? He said, it comes in the back door. People who are friends of my parents bring it, and it's always on a tray, and sometimes it's also in a basket. Sometimes it has potato chips on the top, and I don't like potato chips on top of my food. Casserole. I said, oh, now I know what you're talking about, that mixed food. That can definitely be a problem for a boy. What do you like to eat? He said, all I want to eat is hot dogs. I only want to eat hot dogs. I don't want any more of that mixed food. I said, there shall be no more mixed food at your place. Then I had to break it to his mother, a grieving widow, that he was going to go on the hot dog diet for a week. But I thought this was a good idea. We'd deal with the pediatrician later if we needed to. That's the kind of bossiness that you see in young children who are trying to get control over something that's been completely disorganized for them. It's also, I believe, what we see in the artifacts and the spontaneous memorials that we see in Shanksville, that we saw at every grave in Montoursville after TWA 800 went down, that we saw at the 427 perimeter of that crash site. People spontaneously offer memorials along roadsides. They offer them where there has been a car accident. They create them now in social media. And those, I think, are important ways of saying, I cannot change what happened, but I can control what I do about it now. And I think that it's very important to be patient with that kind of need for control. I always say trauma survivors are able to do anything they want to around me as long as they're safe, because they really need to get control over something. And that's a basic premise of helping folks who've been through a trauma. The continued questioning is a good example of children trying to get control of the information. And you see these same reactions actually in adults. Nervousness and something we call hypervigilance means that you are a little bit jumpy. The hypervigilance is just, you're just a little edgy. You don't ever quite relax. It also, of course, feeds into sleep problems. Not willing to take a new adventure, to try a new sport, to take a test, to learn something new. I worked with a child once whose mother died when she was 8, and the child was terrified of cursive. You learn cursive when you're about 8, and she just couldn't bring herself to learn it. I think one of the most therapeutic things I ever did as a former teacher was teach her how to write in cursive. The moodiness and the anger is, again, a reaction to that shock and to that surprise. The hypervigilance of children, I've noticed, also is of all senses. I don't have a particularly great sense of smell, and so I'm always struck when children will, when you say, tell me the things that you are remembering that are making you a little bit scared, and they will say, I remember how it smelled. I'll remember the sounds. I know that siren, but it smelled, it had a smell. And whether that's from, real or imagined, it really doesn't matter. The helplessness that children experience lends itself to these kinds of behaviors. These are just echoes of somebody who's been through that kind of experience where they've had no control. Children who have been through a trauma often are very critical of other people. They become very judgmental. The helplessness that children face in pediatric units is responded to often by pediatric nurses who say, you can have a choice. We can either put this Band-Aid on or we can put that Band-Aid on. Or we have to take your blood now, but you can either hold my hand or you can hold your stuffed animal. So those kinds of small choices that we offer children who are going through a highly stressful experience give them the sense that they are controlling something, even if it's not what has already happened or will happen. Stubbornness, insistence on having one's own way, and also there is always some concern about risk-taking behaviors. Very often after a trauma in a school, for example, we always alert those who are supervising playgrounds to watch, because this is going to be the week that they all try to jump down the entire flight of stairs. I worked in a school where a middle schooler, and they can be a little squirrely, broke his leg because he just decided that the week after that shooting he would jump down an entire flight of stairs. And I thought we had had enough supervision, but you can't always tell. And lo and behold, I was back in that school for the 6-month anniversary, and he had the other leg in a cast. And I bumped into his teacher, and I said, what happened to him now? Does he have maybe a bone disorder? She says, no, he decided to try it again. So you do see this. I remember a young child who was told, you have the family plan in a disaster, and the Red Cross suggests that families meet and have a family plan of how we will get together and what we will do if there's a disaster or a flood. And one child said, wait a minute, you're telling me that I'm going to sit in the basement with you people and eat Chef Boyardee out of a can? Who's responsible for this anyway? And the parent said, well, the president had to declare war. She says, you people can stay down in this basement and eat all the cold Chef Boyardee you want to. I'm going upstairs and I'm calling the White House. She was not going to have her diet interfered with by some, disaster. Fear creates a kind of grip of our thinking. It creates a loss of concentration and memory, an absent-mindedness. I remember coming home one night after 4/27, and my husband is very, very supportive. His father was a general surgeon right here in Westmoreland County for many, many years, so he's grown up around crisis. And the next morning he was standing over me with coffee and my car keys. And I said, well, honey, I have to get dressed first before I go back out. He said, honey, I just have a question. How long do you think these car keys have been in the passenger side door of your car? I said, I don't know. Is that where you found them? He said, yes. Didn't you hear anything, honey? I said, I did hear this clicking sound, but I wasn't really paying attention. My banker issued 2 ATM cards to me. She says, we're really not supposed to do this, but I'm going to put one Mary Margaret and one Margaret Mary, and they won't really know because given the work you do, you need 2 ATM cards because you lose one about every 6 months. That kind of absent-mindedness comes with this work, and it's, I think, in part a response to the fear and the nervousness that you experience. The other thing that we, of course, know is that reminders of the event cause people to kind of rethink about it. Just as Adam said, these photos are bringing back a lot of reactions and feelings for him. After 427 went down, I went through all of the elementary schools in that area, and that plane went down very near a school. And I thought to myself, really? How many classrooms have to have airplane mobiles? They were everywhere. I don't remember ever seeing so many airplanes in schools before. And we had to take them all down, and we chose to take them all down because we just didn't want the children having that continual visual reminder. Children who have experienced a fire have a very difficult time with the mandatory state-ordered fire drills that we have in schools roughly every couple of months. So these are the kinds of reminders that trigger the response, and then you have a student looking across the desk from you who's really daydreaming, or they appear to be daydreaming, and they're just in a little bit of a different space mentally. The anxiety about being separated, which Andrea spoke about this morning, and I see this even, we all see this even in teenagers. One of my colleagues said her child lost a friend at college, and she said, do you know, for 6 months, my daughter would call and say, I love you, Mom, I love you, Mom. She said she hadn't told me she loved me for 16 years. Now I've got to be sure to remember to say it back to her at every phone call. But it's that kind of clinginess that we see. Horror, of course, is very difficult to watch children experience, even after the event is over and they are physically safe. The numbness that people describe, the sense of things are surreal, the nightmares, the difficulty falling asleep, these are all little signs that the child has experienced a significant and very disturbing event. Thoughts about death and dying. You will notice in the artifacts and the notes, and I hope you will take some time now to reach over and pick up those artifacts, if you will. Look at those artifacts as evidence of children, and I do believe most of these were not left by adults but by children. What do you think the child who held what you are holding now believed they were doing? How was that an expression of perhaps a distant witness's response to some of these kinds of experiences? Look at the readings that are on your tables. Maybe I think maybe they're paper clipped together, or you could look at them. You know, what does this huge teddy bear mean when left by a child? What was that child trying to convey? You will see in the messages drawings about the bad guys, and I hope they get them, and I hope they go to jail forever. You'll see a lot of preoccupation with law enforcement and other means that children conjure up to think of themselves as safe. And then you see the deeply insightful and very moving messages about, I am so glad you were so brave, because I don't know if I would be so brave. So you hear children, as Ms. Miller says, who are doing their own thinking aloud, as we call it in education. So take time to look at these. You're not disturbing me, certainly, to pass things around. And look at the messages as evidence of some of these kinds of reactions, even though those who left these perhaps were not experiencing what we would consider direct trauma. Behavioral responses to trauma are the ones you would probably expect. They parallel these key components of trauma. You will see play and art, as we've seen this morning, that involves reenacting the trauma. I am sure that many toy airplanes went aloft after 9/11 in many, many living rooms and classrooms and minds. You see silly behavior, which is often very disconcerting for adults. I think Adam mentioned that adults were quick to say to their children, "Shh, be quiet now." And one of the things that we do for families and for schools is to say to them, children can't grieve for really long periods of time, as Andrea said. They have to have a break from it. And sometimes their way of grieving seems very socially inappropriate to the adults in their midst. Physical symptoms, of course, are changes in appetite, which may be that you don't like mixed food, headaches, stomach aches, sleep disturbances. Children have trouble falling asleep, they have trouble getting awake, or they fall asleep and then wake up in the middle of the night with nightmares. Often as children have televisions in their room, we find that their sleep is very disturbed. Parents think they've tucked the children in for the night, and then they go and get on the telephone and talk to their best friend about their day and their adult experiences of an event. And what we find out from interviewing children is that they did not go to sleep. They stayed up all night and listened to what mom was talking to her girlfriend about, or they turned on the television in their rooms. My children are both young adults. They do not have televisions in their rooms, and they know they will never have a television in their rooms because mother does this kind of work. I guess they can have a laptop now. Somatic complaints that don't seem to have any real physical origin or medical origin are very common. Emotional responses, and now you're going to start to see these same themes play out. There are many that we've mentioned already. Preoccupation with crime and criminals and the bad guys. This is often played out when young children as the monsters or the vampires, the action figures come into play. On our table, there was an action figure. How many of you found an action figure in the... Yes. I mean, an action figure to a child is a way of being much stronger than you ever can be when you're little. One of my favorite people is a colleague who's a taxi driver, now works in children's mental health, and he stopped me one day when we were driving and said, I have a question for you about my grandson. Is it like a sickness if he's two action figures at once? I said, no, that's precocious, very precocious, Renaud. So children will take on these superhero characteristics and characters. Now, what can adults do in the face of all of this? The first thing that you've heard over and over today is to avoid exposing the child to what I would call unsupervised and uncensored media coverage or conversations about the event. That is not to say that children should not go to the Flight 93 memorial site, but it is to say that children should not be left in the living room to watch one after another after another after another of a news program that continually re-exposes them to a traumatic event. Family routines you want to try to hold on to as much as possible, and school routines. If you always began the day with circle time, you should try to begin the day with circle time. If you always stood at the door and greeted the children and you don't really have your heart in it and you feel like you're going to bust out crying, stand at the door and greet the children, because their antennae go up over all of these little changes, and they really do thrive on that return to routine. That is not to say that you ignore the crisis and you don't believe it happened and you never talk about it, but is to say that we can talk about the crisis and work on the crisis only when we have some fundamental kind of Maslow basic needs taken care of, one of which is to get back to routine. In children in war zones around the world, one of the things that the UN and other humanitarian groups first do is get children back to school, whatever kind of school they can. It may just be an area of a refugee camp, but one of the first restorative practices is to get children back into something that looks like school. You say to yourself, well, children are always complaining about having to go to school. They are, but it's part of who they are as youngsters, and it's part of the routine, and they're very, very sensitive when that is disrupted. Unnecessary separations are not a good idea. If there's any possibility of keeping children close to family members and caregivers, it's important. One of the guiding principles in crisis responding in school-age children is the safe reunification of parents and children as soon as it is possible to do so. I remember being asked after a group of young people witnessed a horrible crime while they were on a mission trip, and we were called to the airport and asked if we would meet with the families when the children, they were young, they were teenagers, got off the plane to return home. And I said, we'll be happy to be there, but I really don't think that's what those families and those young adults are going to want. They're going to walk right past us to get in the car and go home. They need to be with one another. There will be other times when we can reach out and support them. Reassurance is very powerful, whether you're an adult who's been through trauma, as we've experienced today, or a child. And the handout that you have, the longer one, has the website of our project Reassure at the bottom. Shortly after, well, actually in hours after Hurricane Katrina, my brother, who's a paramedic, called me to say, you've got to send me some resources. I have consoled my fourth child with autism today in the shelter, and people here don't know what to do with a child who's banging his head on the wall. And I know enough to do because my sister's a special educator, but you got to get me something. And I get one phone call, and I'll call you tomorrow. And I looked for resources for children with special needs in trauma. There was one thing on how to get a blind person out of a fire. There was something on how to sign to somebody that you needed to get to a safe shelter, and there was really nothing. And I thought, oh my goodness, how can this be? We have this gaping hole in the field. So the second day, my brother called me from the medic unit and said, okay, so what do you have that I can use, and how are you going to get it to me? I said, I'm sorry, Kenneth, there really isn't anything. He said, then you'd better get to making it now. Little irritability, bossiness, control, you get it. So my other brother, who's a writer, called me and says, listen, a group of us, my friend's coming down, she's in Canada, she's a web designer, we're getting in the car, we're going to New Orleans. I said, Tommy, they don't want you in New Orleans. You can't get into New Orleans. They don't need a bunch of writers in New Orleans, trust me. No, we have to do something. We just have to take action. We can't just sit here and watch this on television. I said, Tommy, forget about it. You can't get in. They don't need you. You don't have the skills they want. He said, well, then what are we going to do? I said, I have just the project for you. So a group of mental health trauma folks and a group of writers and editors and a Canadian web designer, whom I've never met, got together and put together Project Reassure, which is just a very tiny, simple project of easy to read, downloadable, free handouts. And you have one, I brought you one on how to reassure a child with developmental disabilities who is who's confused. And the editors worked on the readability level so that none of the guidelines and handouts would be written in mental health speak. And the mental health folks drafted the first drafts, and these went back and forth around the country until we got these really simple, easy-to-read handouts that the grandmother whose Bible study group in Des Moines had decided to take in orphans, we were writing for her. We were writing for the people in the Astrodome who could be there all night and didn't know anything about trauma and sure as heck weren't going to go and look at a whole slide presentation or read those long tables. So you're welcome to them. The resources, we've left them there. They've been apparently useful to others after traumatic events, and they're free for anybody who would find them useful. We also welcome contributions. If there are things that you have found that were very, very helpful, we always welcome new contributions. It's just a little small website, but it might give you help kind of in a speedy way if you are in this position. These are some of the other guidelines, which I won't go through because I think our earlier presenters have done a wonderful job with this. Ms. Miller talked about clarifying those big distortions in children's understandings. Steve talked about the child who thought it was a fuel tanker, and these are important to do. Adam talked about the dilemma that we all face. How much do you tell children? What do you not tell children? And I would like to tell you, Adam, that we have answers, and we ask ourselves those questions all the time. How long do these reactions last? Well, Judith Herman, who's a superb writer in trauma, says, trauma lasts throughout, it resonates throughout the lifetime. One of my least favorite words, a word that I've come to hate, is this notion of closure. There is no closure after trauma. One can heal, but it is never over. My own father was killed in a car accident. He was killed in January of 1981, and it will never be over for our family. I remember that every single day. So there isn't, never use the word closure for somebody who's experienced this. We find it terribly, terribly oversimplifying and kind of mean. So there's one thing not to do. The reactions last, the acute reactions usually last between 6 and 8 weeks, the very acute impairing reactions. And most people begin to feel a little bit better inch by inch, day by day, once they get past that. But as Andrea very insightfully illustrated, it's a spiral, and you could be feeling really fine, and you're thinking, gosh, I am really now getting better, and then something reminds you of it, and you go back down the little spiral again. But as a therapist once explained it to me, it doesn't mean you're going all the way back down the spiral. It's just a little blip, and you're going to be okay again tomorrow. It might just be a really bad feeling for an hour, and then you're going to be okay, and you can pick yourself up and dust yourself off and do something the next day. Time does seem to ease what we call acute stress reaction, which are those reactions within the first 30 days where you really feel kind of numb and you experience a lot of hypervigilance. If a child is continuing to re-experience images and thoughts and can't go about their sort of normal daily life at all, after 30 or 40 days, if they are becoming quite avoidant of conversations and people and places, and it's really gripping them in that way, if their health is impaired because of their sleeping or their irritability or their overall anxiety, then it is time to get what we call a checkup, a mental health checkup. And there are very many places where you can do that, including places like the Caring Place. You don't have to sort of bundle them up and carry them into a psychiatric hospital. In fact, medicalizing this may not be so helpful for children. One of the most important factors that research would tell us in terms of how children respond is the ability for them to watch and see that the adults in their world are responding and are okay. Children will often map their responses onto and take their cues from the adults who are closest to them, and that includes their teachers. As Ms. Miller said, I am their second grade teacher. If I say it, they believe it. Now, don't go to middle school, because if you say it, they didn't even hear you say it. And if high school, they question it and want to argue both points of it. But it is true that to the extent that you can muster yourself to be present and soothing and trust your good instincts and your judgment, you will be a huge gift to the children in your care. Family protective factors that have been shown to buffer the stress for children who've experienced trauma and to increase what we call their resiliency are at least one stable, secure relationship with a parent. As the child who said, I'm not the saddest girl in the world, I still have my mother. A parental model of constructive coping, so not, binge drinking or racing the car or losing your temper really, really often, and also just closeness, physical proximity to parents. I will close by saying to you who are educators in the room that you must never underestimate the role that you play. Some of the best experts in the field would tell you that you are a part of that bigger caring community that really allows children to recover from trauma. I have said many times that among those people who did not get enough credit on September 11th were those people who very courageously remained at daycares, who remained at schools to take care of other people's children. I am reminded of a little child who said to me after losing his father in an airline crash, he said to me one day, he said, "Do you think my daddy is an angel?" Well, there's a hard question. And as many of the experts today have said, you just kind of want to listen and not inject your own views on a child, because this is obviously something he's been thinking about a lot. And I said, "Boy, that's a really good question. I'd like to know what you think about that." He said, "Oh, I know." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, because last night after I got in bed, I felt him tucking me in with his wings." I thank all of you who metaphorically or really tuck children in with your wings. You are the angels for children when they don't really know what to do or how to do it, and you certainly are and have been a lifetime inspiration to me. It is very gratifying to see so many young people who are interested in this, and it's very encouraging to know that our children will be in very, very safe hands and wings. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm going to introduce my friend Hedda Sherapin, who I've known for over 40 years. Hedda has been working with Mr. Rogers, specifically Mr. Rogers the person, and also with Mr. Rogers Neighborhood Program and the current Fred Rogers Company. And she's spent her entire professional career as a child development specialist working with this program. And, you know, there's this statement, excuse me, behind every famous man is a woman. And Hedda has been and continues to be the professional voice behind Fred Rogers, and she is his presence with us still today. So, Hedda.
Thank you. I asked Steve if we could switch the position between Mary Margaret Kerr and myself, because I'm going to pull a Fred Rogers on you. First of all, I have to say, here comes that word again. I am just so honored to be among you, those of you who are so genuinely and authentically concerned about how do we help the children, not only with the Flight 93 and September 11 story, but goodness knows what there may be ahead for us to be dealing with. But while I'm honored, at the same time, I know what time this is. And I'm sort of reminded of a time when I was asked to speak at a conference for the National Association of Pediatric Nurses and Practitioners. See if you can guess the acronym of that organization. It's the National Association of Pediatric Nurses and Practitioners. Honest to goodness, that group is called NAP. And as I was about to go to speak for this organization, I was walking down the hall out of the office, and Fred Rogers walked alongside me, and he said, "Oh, Hedda, where are you going this time?" And I said, "You're not going to believe the name of this group. It's called NAP." And he said, "Well, I hope they don't nap while you talk." So I'm not going to give you that opportunity, because I'm not going to talk. I'm going to do something that Barbara Vancheri said about Fred Rogers. Barbara Vancheri she still is a reporter for the Post-Gazette, and I remember she came back from an interview with Fred once, and she said, Fred Rogers was like a human prism, that when the light shined on him, he turned it around and he shined it back on you. That's what I'm going to do now. We have been given a smorgasbord of ideas of how to help children. And the plan for today was to start with Flight 93, September 11th. What does this mean to children? How can we understand it? How can you possibly deal with this as the anniversaries come around year after year? And beyond that, not just this, any tragic event in the news that may happen. I know Mary Margaret Kerr has worked with the suicides in the schools besides the other kinds of things or the shootings. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask you at your tables to sit and talk about what are you going to take from what you've heard, a smorgasbord of ideas of all kinds of situations. Assign a secretary in the group, somebody take notes, and see how you can pull together the ideas that have been presented. And then we'll take you further into some of this after we call it out. I'm going to give you, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes or so. It might help if you put up your hand when you feel the conversation has sort of run its course. And after that, then I'll talk with you and ask you to join me in the journey of how do we use this stuff and present the story of Flight 93 to children. So we're going to come all the way around. So the task is talk about what are you going to take from today that will help you in your work if you're either explaining Flight 93 to children, September 11 to children, or any future kind of crisis, even if a child in the classroom has a parent who's died or a sibling or whatever. See what you've made. I'm going to let you digest what you've heard. Go ahead.
On September 10th this year, a remarkable partnership came together to dedicate the Flight 93 National Memorial. That partnership involved the local community, the National Park Service, the National Park Foundation, members of our government, design specialists. We all gathered with thousands of citizens at the Flight 93 National Memorial to dedicate a park. It is official. The park has been dedicated. We now know that there is a place where the remains of our loved ones at the sacred ground will be cared for, will be protected in perpetuity. We know that the land and the community will be respected through this memorial. And we know that we will have a place where we can all gather to honor the individuals that perished on Flight 93 as individuals, and we can honor their collective actions. We can honor the first responders, the community, all those that were so deeply affected by the events of September 11th. But our work's not done. The memorial's not finished. And we are reminded each day as we consider September 11th and as we go out to the memorial to walk alongside the sacred ground that we have a renewed purpose, not only to complete the memorial, but to get the story of the actions of the passengers and crew and the community and the first responders, to get it right, and to get that story to a point where we can teach it to our children. And I thank you all for coming here today to consider how we can deal with some of these difficult issues as we talk to children, as we help them understand a part of our history, whether it's Flight 93, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, or other difficult issues of loss that our children have to face on a daily basis, unfortunately. I want to thank Liddell for doing such a tremendous job, your leadership to help pull all of this together, the friends of Flight 93, what a tremendous group you are, the ambassadors that have stood by this project and been leaders in this project. Certainly the Fred Rogers Center for allowing this body to come together to deliberate, but also to inspire us through the actions that you've taken over the years to help educate us all. St. Vincent's College, this has been a good day. This is one more step forward as we learn how to deal with grief. We learned that we need to keep moving forward. We've got to remember the past, be motivated by the past, but look towards the future. So thank you very much.
I feel very hopeful. I have a very hopeful feeling inside of me. I feel like we have a whole room of friends here today. You know, sometimes sitting out there, I know the Park Service people feel this sometimes, sitting on top of that hill, on that really windy hill, on top of the memorial where their offices are, it feels very lonely out there. And I feel as though this group of people, these presenters and speakers, have really made a commitment to us today by saying we want to help you tell this story. We're with you. We're on board. We're part of the Flight 93 Memorial. And I feel like this group that's sitting before us today, you know, when I was listening to what you were saying, what you were hearing and feeding back to Hedda and the group, was that, you know, you understand, you get it. And I want you to be part of them writing that story. I want you to, inside your packets is a sheet of paper with everyone's names on it. And their emails and their numbers. I want you to filter all that information that I know is on all those pretty little and handsome heads that are out there to these people, because they need your perspective and they want you to be part of it. So please do that.